The dust kicked up from Rebecca Miller's worn boots as she walked down the main road toward Willowbrook Ranch, clutching a folded newspaper advertisement in her sweaty palm. The summer heat of 1892 Nevada pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, but it wasn't the weather that made her nervous. It was the stories she'd heard about Marcus Thornfield, the man who owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and had a reputation for being harder than the desert stone beneath her feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca had been walking since dawn, her stomach empty except for the bitter coffee she'd managed to scrape together from yesterday's grounds. The boarding house in town had given her until sunset to pay what she owed, or she'd be sleeping under the stars with nothing but the clothes on her back. The advertisement had seemed like an answer to her prayers when she'd spotted it pinned to the general store bulletin board. Kitchen help wanted, good wages for the right person. Experience preferred but not required. What it didn't mention was that 3 women had already quit the position in the past 2 months, and none of them would talk about why. As the ranch house came into view, Rebecca felt her breath catch in her throat. The building sprawled across the landscape like something out of a wealthy man's dream. 2 stories of whitewashed wood and gleaming windows that reflected the morning sun. The wraparound porch was wide enough to host a town meeting, and flower boxes overflowed with blooms that must have cost a fortune to maintain in this dry climate. This wasn't just wealth on display. This was power made visible, a statement that Marcus Thornfield could afford luxuries that most people couldn't even imagine. The sound of her footsteps on the wooden porch boards seemed unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. Before she could even raise her hand to knock, the front door swung open with such force that she jumped backward. The man who filled the doorway was nothing like what she'd expected from the stories she'd heard. Marcus Thornfield was younger than the grizzled old rancher she'd pictured, probably in his early 30s with thick dark hair and eyes the color of winter storm clouds. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and his presence seemed to fill not just the doorway but the entire porch around them. His clothes spoke of money but not ostentation. A crisp white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, dark trousers that fit him perfectly, and boots that were clearly expensive but showed the wear of actual work. What struck her most was the way he looked at her, as if he was cataloging every detail of her appearance and filing it away for future reference. His gaze lingered on her patched dress, her calloused hands, the way she unconsciously straightened her shoulders under his scrutiny. "You're here about the kitchen position," he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice was deep and measured, with an accent she couldn't quite place. Not local, certainly. There was something Eastern about it, refined in a way that suggested education and breeding. "Rebecca Miller, I assume." She blinked in surprise. The advertisement hadn't required her to send word ahead, and she certainly hadn't told anyone in town about her intentions. "How did you know my name?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Word travels fast in a small community, Miss Miller. When a young woman asks specific questions about employment opportunities, people notice. They also talk." He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "Come in. We have much to discuss." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior had suggested. The entry hall stretched before them with polished hardwood floors that gleamed like dark honey, and a staircase that curved upward with carved banisters that must have been shipped from somewhere far more civilized than Nevada. Oil paintings in heavy gold frames lined the walls, depicting pastoral scenes that seemed to mock the harsh desert landscape visible through the windows. Everything spoke of refinement and culture, but there was something cold about it all, as if it was more museum than home. Marcus led her through a series of rooms, each more elaborate than the last, until they reached what was clearly his office. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that looked like they'd actually been read, and a massive oak desk dominated the center of the room. Maps covered one wall, marking ranch boundaries and cattle routes with the precision of a military campaign. This was where the real business of the ranch was conducted, and Rebecca could feel the weight of decisions and money that had been made in this room. "Please, sit," Marcus said, indicating a chair positioned directly across from his desk. As she settled into the leather upholstery, she noticed that her chair was slightly lower than his, a subtle psychological advantage that made her feel like a child being called before the schoolmaster. "Tell me about your experience with kitchen work." Rebecca had prepared for this question during her long walk to the ranch, but sitting under Marcus Thornfield's intense gaze made her carefully rehearsed answers feel inadequate. I've been cooking for myself since I was 12, when my mother passed. I worked in the hotel restaurant in Carson City for 6 months before I came here, and I've helped with church suppers and community gatherings. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly. And why did you leave Carson City? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Rebecca had hoped to avoid this particular topic, but she could see in his eyes that he already knew the answer. Marcus Thornfield was the kind of man who made it his business to know everything about the people who entered his sphere. There was a misunderstanding with the hotel owner. He had certain expectations that went beyond cooking. Marcus nodded slowly, and she saw something flicker in his expression that might have been approval. Henry Walsh has a reputation for taking liberties with his female employees. I trust you made your position on his expectations clear. I did. Rebecca lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze directly. Cost me my job, but some things aren't worth the wage. Indeed they aren't. Marcus leaned back in his chair, steeping his fingers as he studied her. The position here involves cooking 3 meals a day for myself and my ranch hands. During busy seasons, that could mean feeding 20 men or more. The work is demanding, the hours are long, and the men can be rough around the edges. Are you prepared for that kind of environment? I am. Rebecca kept her voice steady, though preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her heart was racing. She needed this job more than she'd ever needed anything in her life. I'm not easily intimidated, Mr. Thornfield. No, he said quietly. I don't believe you are. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the sprawling ranch lands that stretched to the horizon. There's something else you should know about this position, Miss Miller. Something that wasn't included in the advertisement. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. This was where he would reveal whatever terrible condition had driven away the previous kitchen workers. What's that? Marcus turned back to face her, and the expression in his eyes was unreadable. The woman who accepts this position won't just be my employee. She'll be my wife. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, leaving her speechless and struggling to understand what she'd just heard. Marriage hadn't been mentioned in the advertisement, hadn't been hinted at during their conversation, hadn't been part of any scenario she'd imagined when she'd walked up to his front door. I'm sorry, what did you say? You heard me correctly. Marcus returned to his chair, but his posture was different now, more formal, as if he was conducting a business negotiation rather than a job interview. I need a wife, Miss Miller. Someone practical and capable. Someone who understands the value of hard work and isn't afraid of challenges. Someone who won't be swayed by romantic nonsense or unrealistic expectations about marriage. Rebecca stared at him, her mind reeling. You're proposing marriage to a complete stranger. I'm proposing a practical arrangement to a woman who finds herself in difficult circumstances. His voice remained calm and businesslike, as if he was discussing cattle prices rather than the rest of her life. You need security and a place to belong. I need a competent woman to manage my household and fulfill certain social obligations. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. And if I refuse, Marcus smiled again, and this time there was something predatory about it. Then you're free to leave, of course. But I should mention that I've spoken with Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house about your situation. She's agreed to extend your credit until this evening, pending the outcome of our conversation. If you choose to decline my offer, I'm afraid you'll find yourself with limited options in town. The threat was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Marcus Thornfield had maneuvered her into a corner before she'd even realized the game was being played. Rebecca felt anger flare in her chest, hot and fierce. You planned this, the advertisement, the timing, everything. I'm a businessman, Miss Miller. I identify what I need, and I take steps to acquire it. He leaned forward slightly, his storm gray eyes fixed on her face. What I need is a wife who will be an asset to my position in this community. Someone intelligent enough to handle the responsibilities of running a large household, strong enough to deal with the challenges of ranch life, and practical enough to understand that marriage is ultimately a business partnership. And what do I get out of this business partnership? Rebecca's voice was sharp with anger, but she kept it controlled. Losing her temper wouldn't help her situation. Security, status, financial stability. A home that won't disappear based on someone else's whims. Marcus gestured toward the opulent room around them. This ranch generates more income in a month than most people see in a year. As my wife, you'd never have to worry about where your next meal is coming from, or whether you'll have a roof over your head. Rebecca stood abruptly, pacing to the window as she tried to process what was happening. Outside, she could see ranch hands going about their morning tasks, leading horses to pasture and checking fences. Normal people living normal lives while she sat in this opulent office being presented with an impossible choice. This is insane. People don't get married like this. People get married for all sorts of reasons, Miss Miller. Love is a luxury that most can't afford. Marcus's voice followed her to the window, steady and implacable. I'm offering you something far more reliable than romantic sentiment. I'm offering you a future. Rebecca turned back to face Marcus, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The smart thing would be to walk away, to find some other solution to her problems that didn't involve binding herself to a man she'd known for less than an hour. But the smart thing assumed she had other options. And the cold reality was that she didn't. The boarding house debt wasn't her only problem. She had exactly $14 to her name, no family to turn to, and winter was coming. In 6 months, she'd either be married to Marcus Thornfield or dead from starvation and exposure. How long do I have to decide? She asked. Until sunset, Marcus replied without hesitation. The minister arrives at 6 o'clock. If you agree, we'll be married this evening. If not, you're free to go. That's today. You expect me to decide about marriage in 1 day. I expect you to decide about your future in 1 day. Marcus stood and moved closer to her, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with leather and something uniquely masculine. But to help with your decision, let me show you what you'd be gaining. He led her through more of the house, and Rebecca found herself grudgingly impressed, despite her anger at being manipulated. The kitchen was enormous and modern, with a cast-iron stove that must have cost a fortune, and enough workspace to prepare meals for an army. The pantry was stocked with supplies that represented more food than she'd seen in one place since leaving Carson City. Upstairs, he showed her what would be her bedroom, a spacious room with windows overlooking the front pasture and furniture that was both elegant and comfortable. You'd have your own space, Marcus explained as they stood in the doorway. I'm not interested in a romantic marriage, Miss Miller. This would be a partnership of convenience and mutual respect. You'd run the household, manage the domestic staff, and handle the social obligations that come with being the wife of a prominent rancher. In return, you'd have security, status, and the freedom to make this house into whatever you wanted it to be. Rebecca walked to the window, looking out at the vast expanse of ranch land that stretched to the mountains in the distance. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, this desert country that demanded strength and stubbornness from anyone who wanted to survive it. She could imagine herself here, could picture waking up to this view every morning, instead of staring at the water-stained ceiling of her boarding house room. What about the ranch hands? She asked. How would they react to suddenly having a new mistress they'd never met? They'll treat you with the respect due to my wife, or they'll find employment elsewhere. Marcus's voice carried the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. I don't tolerate disrespect toward women on my property. And if I'm unhappy, if this arrangement doesn't work out the way you've planned. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when Rebecca turned to look at him, she saw something complex in his expression. Then we'll deal with that situation if it arises. But I should warn you, Miss Miller, I'm not in the habit of changing my mind once I've made a decision. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. This wouldn't be a marriage she could easily escape if things went wrong. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine, but she also felt something else, a strange kind of excitement at the challenge he represented. Marcus Thornfield was unlike any man she'd ever encountered, dangerous and compelling in equal measure. They returned to his office, and Marcus pulled out a document from his desk drawer. I've taken the liberty of having a marriage contract drawn up. It outlines the terms of our arrangement, including your responsibilities and the financial security you'd enjoy as my wife. Rebecca took the papers, scanning the legal language that was mostly incomprehensible to her. What she could understand was generous beyond her wildest dreams. As Marcus's wife, she'd have access to household accounts, a personal allowance that was more than she'd ever earned in a year, and provisions for her security even if something happened to him. "This is very generous," she admitted. "I believe in taking care of what belongs to me," Marcus said, and something in his tone made Rebecca look up sharply. There was possessiveness in his voice that sent another chill through her, but also something that might have been genuine care. "I need time to think," Rebecca said, though they both knew she'd already made her decision. The alternative was too grim to contemplate. "Of course, take all the time you need until sunset." Marcus moved to the door. "Mrs. Calloway, my housekeeper, will show you to the guest room where you can rest and consider your options. Lunch will be served at noon." Rebecca found herself installed in yet another beautifully appointed room, this one clearly designed for visitors of importance. The bed was covered with a quilt that looked handmade and expensive, and a wash basin with hot water had been provided for her comfort. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the marriage contract and trying to understand how her life had changed so completely in the space of a few hours. Mrs. Calloway appeared at the door, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Miss Miller, I thought you might like some tea while you're thinking." "Thank you." Rebecca accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the steam and letting the warmth calm her nerves. "Mrs. Calloway, may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear. How long have you worked for Mr. Thornfield?" "Going on 8 years now." Mrs. Calloway settled into the chair by the window, her manner suggesting she was prepared for a longer conversation. "Came here when he first bought the ranch. What kind of employer is he?" Mrs. Calloway considered the question carefully. "He's fair, demanding, certainly, and he expects excellence from everyone around him. But he pays well and he takes care of his people. When my husband took sick last winter, Mr. Thornfield made sure we had the best doctor in the territory, and covered all the expenses. And the women who worked in the kitchen before, why did they leave?" "Ah." Mrs. Calloway's expression grew more guarded. "That's a different matter entirely. Mr. Thornfield is a complicated man, Miss Miller. He's been hurt in the past, and it's made him cautious about trusting people. The previous kitchen workers weren't necessarily suited to the unique challenges of working for him." "What kind of challenges?" "The kind that require a strong woman who can stand up for herself." Mrs. Calloway met Rebecca's eyes directly. "If you take this position, whether as employee or wife, you'll need to be prepared to hold your ground. Mr. Thornfield respects strength, but he has no patience for weakness." After Mrs. Calloway left, Rebecca found herself walking through the house, exploring rooms and trying to imagine herself living here permanently. The library drew her attention, filled with books on subjects ranging from literature to agriculture to philosophy. Many of them showed signs of regular use, and she realized that Marcus Thornfield was far more educated than the typical rancher. In the music room, she discovered a piano that looked like it had been played recently, and sheet music scattered across the bench suggested someone in the house was actively musical. The dining room was formal enough to host important guests, with a table that could seat 20 and china that probably cost more than most people's homes. Everything about the house spoke of refinement and culture, but also of loneliness. It was too perfect, too pristine, like a museum exhibit rather than a home where people actually lived and loved, and fought and made up. Rebecca found herself wondering what had happened to make Marcus Thornfield choose isolation over companionship, business arrangements over romance. The afternoon passed slowly, and Rebecca found herself no closer to a decision. Part of her was tempted by the security and status Marcus was offering. Another part was terrified of binding herself to a man who spoke of marriage in terms of business acquisitions. But the largest part of her was simply tired of being afraid, tired of worrying about money and shelter and safety. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Rebecca made her choice. It wasn't based on love or even attraction, though she couldn't deny that Marcus Thornfield was a compelling figure. It was based on survival and the recognition that sometimes life forced you to make impossible decisions with incomplete information. She found Marcus in his office, still working at his desk, as if the outcome of their conversation was never in doubt. When she entered, he looked up and seemed to read her decision in her face. "I'll marry you," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. "But I have conditions." Marcus leaned back in his chair, and she saw something that might have been approval flicker in his eyes. "I'm listening. I want respect. From you and from everyone on this ranch. I won't be treated like a servant or a possession." Rebecca moved closer to his desk, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I want my own money, separate from the household accounts. And I want your word that if this arrangement becomes unbearable for either of us, we'll find a civilized way to end it." "Agreed." Marcus stood and extended his hand to her. "Welcome to Willowbrook Ranch, Mrs. Thornfield." As Rebecca shook his hand, she felt the weight of her decision settle around her like chains made of gold. She'd just agreed to marry a man she barely knew. A man who spoke of love as a luxury, and marriage as a business transaction. But she'd also just secured her future in a way she'd never thought possible. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the strange mixture of hope and fear coursing through Rebecca's veins. In a few hours, she'd be Mrs. Marcus Thornfield, mistress of the largest ranch in 3 counties, and wife to one of the most powerful men in the territory. She had no idea that by accepting his proposal, she'd just set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about strength, survival, and the complicated nature of love itself. Part 2. Initial Problem Recognition. The ceremony took place in Marcus's study as the last light faded from the desert sky. Reverend Williams arrived precisely at 6 o'clock. A thin man with gentle eyes who seemed surprised by the hasty nature of the proceedings, but asked no uncomfortable questions. Calloway and 2 ranch hands served as witnesses, their faces carefully neutral as Rebecca spoke vows she'd never imagined saying to a man she'd met that morning. Marcus's voice was steady and sure as he promised to honor and protect her, but Rebecca noticed he omitted the word love from his recitation. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed her cheek with the same business-like efficiency he'd shown throughout their negotiations. The kiss was brief and formal, but Rebecca felt an unexpected jolt of electricity at the contact that left her wondering what she'd gotten herself into. After the Reverend departed, Marcus turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, and the name sounded strange in his mouth. "I trust you'll find your accommodations satisfactory. Tomorrow Mrs. Calloway will begin instructing you in the management of the household." Tomorrow, Rebecca felt a flutter of panic. What about tonight? "Tonight you rest. The transition to married life can be overwhelming, and I prefer my employees to be well rested and efficient." Marcus moved toward the door, then paused. "There's a lock on your bedroom door, Rebecca. Use it if it makes you more comfortable." The use of her first name was the first personal thing he'd said to her all day, and something in his tone suggested the lock comment wasn't entirely about her comfort. Rebecca found herself wondering what secrets lurked behind Marcus Thornfield's controlled exterior. What experiences had taught him to treat marriage like a military campaign rather than a union of hearts? Her wedding night was spent alone in the guest room, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what she'd done. She was married to a stranger who spoke of her as an employee, living in a house that felt more like a palace than a home, committed to a man who seemed to have no more emotional investment in their union than he would in purchasing cattle. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of golden chains and storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul. The next morning, Rebecca woke to find a tray of breakfast outside her door, along with a note written in Marcus's precise handwriting. "Mrs. Calloway will meet you in the kitchen at 8 o'clock to begin your orientation. Your personal belongings from the boarding house have been retrieved and placed in your wardrobe. Welcome to your new life." The gesture of retrieving her things was thoughtful, but the tone of the note remained businesslike. Rebecca dressed in her best dress, a blue cotton garment that suddenly seemed shabby compared to the elegance surrounding her, and made her way downstairs to begin learning her new role. Mrs. Calloway was waiting in the kitchen with a steaming cup of coffee, and a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield. I hope you slept well as could be expected." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that was far superior to anything she'd been able to afford on her own. "Mrs. Calloway, may I ask you to call me Rebecca, at least when we're alone?" "Of course, dear, and you may call me Margaret." The older woman's smile widened. "Now, let me show you how this household operates." The next few hours were a whirlwind of information. Rebecca learned that the ranch employed 23 men year-round, with the number swelling to nearly 40 during cattle drives and branding seasons. The kitchen operated from before dawn until well after sunset, providing 3 meals a day, plus snacks and coffee for men who worked hard in demanding conditions. Margaret showed her the schedules, the supply lists, the intricate system of meal planning that kept everyone fed and satisfied. The operation was more complex than anything Rebecca had imagined, requiring skills in organization and management that went far beyond simple cooking. "Mr. Thornfield is very particular about the quality of meals," Margaret explained as they toured the massive pantry. "He believes that well-fed men work harder and complain less. You'll find he's generous with the food budget, but he expects excellence in return." "What about his personal preferences?" Rebecca asked. "What does he like to eat?" Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "He's not a man who reveals his preferences easily. He'll eat whatever is prepared without complaint. But I've noticed he appreciates subtle flavors and careful presentation. He was educated back east, and his tastes reflect that background." As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd changed from his formal clothes into work attire, and Rebecca was struck by how different he looked. The expensive suit had made him seem like a businessman playing at being a rancher, but in worn jeans and a chambray shirt with sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd built his fortune through hard work and determination. "Good morning, Rebecca," he said. And again she noticed the subtle shift in his tone when he used her first name. "How are you settling in?" "It's overwhelming," she admitted honestly. "But I'm learning." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Honesty is always preferable to false confidence. Margaret, I trust you're showing her everything she needs to know." "Of course, Mr. Thornfield. Rebecca is a quick learner." "Excellent." Marcus moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, his movements economical and precise. "Rebecca, I'd like you to join me for dinner this evening. We have matters to discuss regarding your new position." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. What kind of matters? "Practical ones. The social obligations that come with being Mrs. Marcus Thornfield. The expectations of the community. The role you'll play in ranch operations." Marcus sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. "Nothing alarming, I assure you. Simply necessary conversations." After he left, Margaret shook her head sympathetically. "He's not an easy man to read, is he?" "No," Rebecca agreed. "Sometimes I think he's being kind, and other times I feel like he's evaluating me for weaknesses." "Perhaps both," Margaret said quietly. Mr. Thornfield learned early that kindness can be seen as weakness by the wrong people. He's careful about when and how he shows his softer side. The rest of the day passed in a blur of lessons and introductions. Rebecca met the ranch hands during lunch service, noting how they treated her with careful respect that felt more like wariness than acceptance. These were men who'd worked for Marcus for years, and they clearly weren't sure what to make of his sudden marriage to a woman none of them had ever seen before. Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, was particularly watchful. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, and Rebecca could feel him studying her every move as she served the noon meal. When she accidentally dropped a ladle while ladling stew, his expression grew thoughtful in a way that made her nervous. "Don't mind Tom," Margaret whispered as they cleaned up after the meal. "He's protective of Mr. Thornfield. They've been through some difficult times together, and Tom doesn't trust easily." "What kind of difficult times?" Margaret glanced around to make sure they were alone before answering. Mr. Thornfield wasn't always wealthy, Rebecca. He built this ranch from nothing, and there were people who tried to take advantage of him along the way. People who saw his success and wanted to claim a piece of it for themselves. What does that have to do with me? Nothing, I hope. But Tom remembers what happened with the last woman who tried to get close to Mr. Thornfield. He's naturally suspicious of anyone new. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. What happened with the last woman? Margaret's expression grew guarded. That's not my story to tell, dear. But I will say this, Mr. Thornfield has good reason to be cautious about matters of the heart. The afternoon brought Rebecca's first real challenge as mistress of the household. A supply delivery arrived with several items missing and others of inferior quality than what had been ordered. The delivery man, a rough character named Pete Morrison, seemed to assume that the new Mrs. Thornfield would be too intimidated to question his substitutions. This isn't what was ordered, Rebecca said firmly, checking the invoice against the delivered goods. We asked for 20 pounds of premium beef, not 15 pounds of tough cuts. Pete Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dust and grinned unpleasantly. That's what we had available, lady. Take it or leave it. I'll leave it. Rebecca crossed her arms and met his gaze directly. And I'll be speaking with your supervisor about this attempted fraud. Now hold on there, missy. Ain't no call for harsh words. The harsh words will come from my husband when he learns that his suppliers are trying to cheat his household. Rebecca kept her voice steady, but she let steel creep into her tone. I suggest you return to town and bring the correct order, or Thornfield Ranch will find new suppliers. Pete Morrison's grin faded as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd expected. Mrs. Thornfield, there ain't no need to get your husband involved in business matters. My husband involves himself in anything that affects his ranch, Mr. Morrison, and cheating his household definitely affects his ranch. Rebecca stepped closer, drawing on reserves of courage she'd built during her confrontation with the hotel owner in Carson City. The question is whether you want to fix this problem quietly or explain to Mr. Thornfield why you thought his wife was too stupid to notice your deception. 20 minutes later, Pete Morrison was loading the correct supplies from his wagon while muttering under his breath about uppity women. Rebecca supervised the delivery personally, checking each item against the invoice and making notes about the delay in her household ledger. Tom Bradley had watched the entire interaction from the barn, and when Pete Morrison's wagon disappeared down the road, he approached Rebecca with something that might have been respect in his weathered face. That was well handled, Mrs. Thornfield, he said quietly. Pete Morrison's been trying to shortchange this ranch for months, but he usually deals with Margaret, and she's too polite to call him on his tricks. Someone who tries to cheat you once will try again, Rebecca replied. Better to stop it immediately. Yes, ma'am. Tom touched the brim of his hat. If you don't mind me saying so, you handled that like someone who knows how to take care of herself. I've had to learn. Rebecca looked at the supplies now properly stacked on the porch. Mr. Bradley, may I ask you something? Sure thing. The men seem nervous around me. Is it because I'm new, or is there something else I should know? Tom considered the question carefully. It's not you personally, Mrs. Thornfield. It's the situation. Most of us have worked for Mr. Thornfield for years, and we've seen how he handles business. Everything he does is planned out months in advance. This sudden marriage, bringing in a wife none of us knew existed, it's got everyone wondering what changed. What do you think changed? I think Mr. Thornfield decided he needed something this ranch couldn't provide on its own. Tom said slowly. Question is whether that something is what he thinks it is, or whether he's going to find out he miscalculated. That evening, Rebecca found herself sitting across from Marcus at the formal dining table, feeling ridiculously out of place in the ornate setting. She'd changed into her best dress, but it still seemed inadequate for the elegant surroundings. Marcus, meanwhile, had dressed for dinner as if he was entertaining important guests, wearing a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his storm-gray eyes seem even more intense. I heard about your encounter with Pete Morrison, Marcus said as Margaret served the first course. Tom Bradley was impressed with how you handled the situation. He was trying to cheat you, Rebecca replied. I don't like cheats. Neither do I. Marcus's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire face. It's good to know my instincts about you were correct. What instincts? That you're stronger than you appear. That you won't let people take advantage of you. Marcus cut his meat with precise movements, his attention seemingly focused on his plate. Those are valuable qualities in a wife. Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Is that why you married me? Because you thought I'd be useful? Partly. Marcus met her eyes directly. But also because I recognize something in you that I see in myself. A willingness to do whatever it takes to survive. And what makes you think I'm just surviving? Because people who are truly living don't agree to marry strangers for security. Marcus's voice was gentle, but his words cut deep. We're both survivors, Rebecca. The question is whether we can help each other do more than just survive. The conversation moved to practical matters after that. Marcus explained the social expectations that came with being the wife of a prominent rancher, the dinner parties and community events she'd be expected to attend, the relationships she'd need to cultivate with other ranch wives and town leaders. The territorial governor's wife is hosting a reception next month, Marcus said. We'll be expected to attend, and your behavior will reflect on both of us. Are you comfortable in formal social situations? I've never been in truly formal social situations, Rebecca admitted, but I learn quickly. I'm sure you do. Marcus refilled her wine glass, and she noticed his hands were elegant despite the calluses that spoke of hard work. Margaret can help you with the appropriate clothing and etiquette. The important thing is to remember that you belong there. You're Mrs. Marcus Thornfield now, and that name carries weight in this territory. After dinner, Marcus walked her to the foot of the stairs, and for a moment Rebecca thought he might kiss her goodnight. Instead he simply said, "Sleep well, Rebecca. Tomorrow will be another learning day." As she prepared for bed in her elegant room, Rebecca found herself thinking about Marcus's words. She was Mrs. Marcus Thornfield now, with all the privileges and responsibilities that name entailed. But she was also still Rebecca Miller, the woman who'd walked up to his door with nothing but determination and a desperate need for security. The question was which version of herself would emerge stronger as she learned to navigate her new life. Part 3. Discovering Hidden Complexity. Rebecca's third day as Mrs. Marcus Thornfield began with a crisis that revealed just how complicated her new life was going to be. She woke to shouting in the yard and rushed to her window to see a group of men on horseback confronting Marcus near the barn. Even from a distance she could see the tension in every line of his body, the way his hand rested casually near his gun. Margaret appeared at her door, her face pale with worry. "Mrs. Thornfield, you need to stay inside. There's trouble brewing." "What kind of trouble?" Rebecca quickly dressed, her hands trembling slightly as she buttoned her bodice. "Land dispute. Mr. Thornfield's been fighting it for months, but it looks like things are coming to a head." Margaret wrung her hands anxiously. "The Carver family claims part of our north pasture belongs to them. They've been making threats about taking what's theirs." Rebecca moved back to the window, studying the confrontation below. The leader of the group was a large man with a black beard and eyes that seemed to burn with righteous anger. He was gesticulating wildly, clearly making demands or threats that Marcus was receiving with stony silence. "How many men does Carver have with him?" Rebecca asked. 6, maybe 7. "Mr. Thornfield has Tom and 4 of the hands with him. But those Carver boys are known for their tempers." Margaret's voice was tight with fear. "There's been bad blood between the families for years." As Rebecca watched, the confrontation grew more heated. She saw Marcus step forward, his posture becoming more aggressive, and suddenly understood that this wasn't just about land. This was about power, respect, and the kind of territorial disputes that could turn deadly in a place where the law was often too far away to matter. The Carver group wheeled their horses and rode away, but not before their leader shouted something that made Marcus's hand move closer to his gun. Even after they disappeared over the ridge, Marcus remained in the yard talking urgently with Tom Bradley, their conversation too distant to overhear but clearly serious. "Is this normal?" Rebecca asked Margaret. These kinds of confrontations, more common than I'd like, Margaret admitted. This territory is still rough, Mrs. Thornfield. Men settle disputes with guns more often than lawyers. And Mr. Thornfield's success has made him enemies. When Marcus finally came inside, his face was grim, and his movements carried the controlled energy of a man preparing for trouble. He found Rebecca in the kitchen, where she was helping Margaret prepare breakfast with hands that weren't quite steady. "I suppose you saw our visitors," Marcus said without preamble. "I did. Margaret told me it's about land." "It's about more than land." Marcus poured himself coffee, but Rebecca noticed he didn't relax his vigilant posture. "Jeremiah Carver believes this ranch should have been his inheritance. His father and mine had a business disagreement 20 years ago, and Carver's been nursing that grudge ever since." "What kind of business disagreement?" Marcus's smile was cold and humorless. "The kind where one man honors his contracts and the other doesn't. Carver's father tried to back out of a cattle deal when prices dropped, leaving my father holding worthless promissory notes. My father sued and won, but the Carvers have never forgiven the humiliation." Rebecca felt a chill of understanding. "So this isn't really about you at all. This is about settling old scores." "In Jeremiah Carver's mind, I'm responsible for his family's failures because I've succeeded where they couldn't." Marcus set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "He's been waiting for an opportunity to strike back, and he thinks my sudden marriage might be a sign of weakness." "Why would marriage be seen as weakness?" "Because it gives him something to target beyond just me." Marcus's gray eyes met hers, and she saw something that might have been regret flickering in their depths. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I should have warned you that becoming my wife would make you a target." The implications of what he was saying settled over Rebecca like a heavy blanket. She'd married him for security, but instead she'd placed herself in danger from enemies she didn't even know existed. The irony was bitter, but it also sparked something fierce in her chest. "What exactly does Carver want?" she asked. "Justice in his twisted mind. He wants to see me lose everything the way his family did." Marcus leaned against the counter, his posture casual but his eyes alert. "The land dispute is just his latest attempt to find legal grounds to challenge my holdings. And if he can't find legal grounds, then he'll try illegal ones." Marcus's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "Men like Jeremiah Carver don't give up easily, and they're not particular about methods." Over the following days, Rebecca began to understand the full complexity of her situation. The ranch wasn't just a business operation. It was a fortress in hostile territory, surrounded by people who resented Marcus's success and would be happy to see him fail. The marriage that was supposed to provide her with security had instead placed her at the center of conflicts she'd never imagined. She learned about the water rights disputes that had been simmering for years, the political maneuvering that surrounded every business decision, the careful balance Marcus maintained between cooperation and confrontation with his neighbors. Every alliance came with a price, every friendship carried the potential for betrayal, and every success bred new enemies. The revelation came in pieces through overheard conversations and carefully worded explanations from Margaret. Rebecca discovered that 3 previous attempts had been made to drive Marcus off his land through various forms of sabotage and intimidation. Fences had been cut, cattle had been poisoned, and buildings had been mysteriously damaged in ways that couldn't quite be proven as deliberate. "Why does he stay?" Rebecca asked Margaret one afternoon as they preserved vegetables in the kitchen. "If there's this much trouble, why not sell the ranch and start over somewhere else?" Margaret's hand stilled on the jars she was sealing. "Because running away would mean they win. Mr. Thornfield isn't the kind of man who gives up what's rightfully his just because other people want to take it. But surely his life would be easier somewhere else. Easier maybe, but not better." Margaret resumed her work, her movements automatic while her mind was clearly elsewhere. "This ranch represents everything Mr. Thornfield has worked for. Selling it would be like admitting that all his efforts were worthless." That evening, Rebecca found Marcus in his office working by lamplight, ledgers and legal documents spread across his desk. He looked up when she entered, and she saw exhaustion in his face that he usually kept carefully hidden. "You look tired," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "There's a lot to manage." Marcus rubbed his temples, a gesture that made him seem more human and less like the controlled businessman he usually projected. "The Carver situation is just one of several problems requiring attention." "What other problems?" Marcus studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth she could handle. "Cattle rustling in the south pasture, pressure from territorial politicians who want me to support candidates I don't trust, suppliers who are trying to form a monopoly on feed prices." He gestured at the papers scattered across his desk. "Running a ranch this size isn't just about cattle and horses, Rebecca. It's about navigating a dozen different conflicts simultaneously." Rebecca looked at the documents, recognizing legal papers and correspondence that suggested the scope of challenges Marcus faced daily. "How do you manage it all?" "Very carefully. And with the understanding that showing weakness invites attack." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating gray eyes. "Which brings me to something we need to discuss." "What's that?" "Your safety. The confrontation with Carver changes things. You can't move around the ranch unescorted anymore, and there are places you'll need to avoid entirely." Rebecca felt a surge of rebellion at the idea of being confined and protected like a helpless child. "I'm not going to hide in the house because some man has a grudge against you. You'll do exactly that if it keeps you alive." Marcus's voice carried an edge of steel that reminded Rebecca of why other men were afraid of him. "This isn't a negotiation, Rebecca. These people are dangerous, and I won't risk your safety to preserve your independence." "And what about your safety? Are you going to hide in the house too?" "I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for years. Maybe I can take care of myself too." Rebecca stood, anger flaring hot in her chest. "I didn't survive on my own for years just to become a prisoner in my own home." Marcus rose as well, moving around the desk until he was standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "This isn't Carson City, Rebecca. This is frontier territory where disputes are settled with guns and women disappear without a trace. I won't have your death on my conscience because you were too stubborn to accept protection. And I won't live in fear because you've made enemies." Rebecca stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated by his size or his anger. "If you wanted a wife who would cower in the corner at the first sign of trouble, you should have married someone else." For a moment, they stood facing each other in tense silence, neither willing to back down. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "You're right," he said quietly. "I didn't marry you to keep you locked away like a prisoner. But I also can't function if I'm constantly worrying about your safety. Then teach me to protect myself." The words came out before Rebecca had fully formed the thought. But she realized she meant them completely. "If this ranch is dangerous, then make sure I'm prepared for the danger." Marcus's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You want to learn to use a gun?" "I want to learn whatever I need to learn to survive here." Rebecca crossed her arms, meeting his gaze steadily. "You said we're both survivors. Well, survivors adapt to their circumstances." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Rebecca could almost see him reassessing his assumptions about her capabilities. "Learning to handle a gun is serious business, Rebecca. It's not something you do halfway." "I don't do anything halfway." "No," Marcus agreed, something that might have been admiration flickering in his eyes. "I don't believe you do." The next morning, Marcus led Rebecca to a secluded area behind the barn where targets had been set up against hay bales. He'd brought several different firearms, from a small derringer that could be concealed in a pocket to a rifle that seemed impossibly heavy in Rebecca's inexperienced hands. "We'll start with the basics," Marcus said, demonstrating how to hold and aim a pistol. "Guns are tools, nothing more. Dangerous tools that demand respect, but tools nonetheless. Rebecca's first attempts were disasters. The recoil caught her off guard, sending shots wild and leaving her hands stinging from the impact. But Marcus was a patient teacher, adjusting her grip and stance with gentle corrections that gradually improved her accuracy. "Don't think of it as violence," he advised as she lined up another shot. "Think of it as precision. The goal is to hit exactly where you're aiming, nothing more." By the end of the first lesson, Rebecca was hitting the target more often than not, though still not with the consistency Marcus demanded. Her hands were sore and her shoulders ached, but she felt a strange sense of accomplishment that went beyond simple marksmanship. "Tomorrow, we'll work on drawing quickly," Marcus said as they cleaned the weapons. "Speed is often more important than perfect accuracy." "Will I ever be as good as you?" Rebecca asked, watching the efficient way he handled the firearms. "That depends on how much you're willing to practice and how badly you want to survive." Marcus met her eyes. "But yes, I believe you have the temperament for it." As they walked back to the house, Rebecca realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. The shooting lesson had been about more than just learning to use a gun. It had been Marcus's way of acknowledging that she was his partner in facing whatever dangers surrounded them, not just someone to be protected and sheltered. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the desert, Rebecca wondered if learning to shoot would be enough to prepare her for the complexities she was only beginning to understand. The ranch was more than just a business operation. It was the center of a web of conflicts and alliances that stretched across the territory. And she was beginning to suspect that Marcus himself was more complicated than the controlled businessman he appeared to be. There were depths to him that she hadn't even begun to explore. Secrets that shaped his careful approach to everything from business to relationships. The question was whether she was strong enough to handle the truth when she finally discovered it. Part 4. Evidence Gathering Phase. Rebecca's education in the realities of ranch life accelerated over the following weeks. As she began to understand the intricate network of relationships that determine success or failure in the territory, what had initially seemed like simple neighbors and business associates revealed themselves to be players in a complex game of power, money, and influence that reached far beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook Ranch. The revelation began with a visit from Eleanor Whitman, the wife of the territorial judge, who arrived on a Tuesday morning in an elegant carriage that seemed wildly out of place against the rustic ranch setting. Eleanor was a woman in her 40s with carefully styled hair and clothes that had clearly been ordered from back east, and her presence immediately put everyone on edge. "Mrs. Thornfield," Eleanor said as Rebecca greeted her on the front porch. "How delightful to finally meet Marcus's mysterious new wife. We were all so surprised to learn of your marriage." The emphasis on surprised carried implications that Rebecca didn't miss. This wasn't a social call, it was an evaluation. Eleanor Whitman was here to take the measure of Marcus's wife and determine where she fit in the established hierarchy of territorial society. "Please, come in," Rebecca said, drawing on lessons in politeness she'd learned from Margaret. "Would you care for tea? That would be lovely." Eleanor's sharp eyes took in every detail of the house's interior as Rebecca led her to the formal sitting room. "Marcus has such exquisite taste. This room could be transported directly to Boston without seeming out of place." They settled into the elegant furniture, and Margaret appeared with a tea service that was clearly the household's finest china. Eleanor accepted her cup with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being served. But Rebecca noticed how the older woman's gaze never stopped moving, cataloging and assessing everything she saw. "I must confess, Mrs. Thornfield, your marriage has been the subject of considerable discussion in town," Eleanor said, after taking a delicate sip of tea. "Marcus has been such a confirmed bachelor for so long that we'd all assumed he'd never marry." "Sometimes circumstances change our assumptions," Rebecca replied carefully. "Indeed they do." Eleanor's smile was sharp as a knife blade. "Tell me, dear,
Where did you meet Marcus? We're all dying to know the romantic details. Rebecca felt the trap being laid with expert precision. Eleanor Whitman was fishing for information, looking for weaknesses or inconsistency she could use to undermine Marcus's position in territorial society. The wrong answer here could damage not just Rebecca's reputation but Marcus's standing with influential people. We met through mutual business interests, Rebecca said, which was technically true even if it omitted the desperate circumstances that had brought her to his door. Sometimes the best relationships develop from practical foundations. How pragmatic of you both. Eleanor set down her teacup with a delicate clink. Of course, practical marriages can be quite successful when both parties understand their roles clearly. The words carried multiple layers of meaning, and Rebecca realized she was being warned as much as evaluated. Eleanor Whitman was making it clear that Rebecca's position in territorial society would depend on how well she fulfilled the expectations of her role as Marcus Thornfield's wife. I'm still learning what my role entails, Rebecca admitted. Perhaps you could offer some guidance. Eleanor's expression brightened with predatory interest. Oh, my dear, I'd be delighted to help. The wives of prominent men have certain obligations to the community, certain standards that must be maintained. There are charitable organizations that require our support, social events that demand our attendance, and political considerations that affect everyone in the territory. Over the next hour, Eleanor outlined a complex web of social obligations that seemed designed more to control than to enlighten. Rebecca learned about the Ladies' Auxiliary that supported the territorial government, the charity committees that provided acceptable outlets for feminine influence, and the informal networks of wives who shaped their husbands' business and political decisions through careful manipulation. The key, Eleanor explained, is understanding that we women wield considerable power, but only when we exercise it properly. Direct confrontation is unseemly, but gentle influence can move mountains. And what happens to women who don't exercise their power properly? Rebecca asked. Eleanor's smile became positively glacial. They find themselves quite isolated, dear. Social isolation in a territory this small can be devastating for both a woman and her husband's prospects. After Eleanor departed, Rebecca sat in the sitting room feeling as if she'd just survived an interrogation disguised as a social call. Margaret found her there 20 minutes later, staring out the window at the departing carriage. How did it go? Margaret asked gently. I think I just learned that my marriage to Marcus has made me part of a game I don't understand the rules to. Rebecca turned to face the older woman. Margaret, what do you know about Eleanor Whitman's influence in the territory? Margaret's expression grew cautious. She's Judge Whitman's wife, which makes her one of the most powerful women in territorial society.
Also ruthless when it comes to protecting what she sees as her interests. What interests would those be? Maintaining the established order. Eleanor and women like her have spent years building their positions in territorial society. They don't welcome newcomers who might upset that balance. Rebecca felt a chill of understanding. She sees me as a threat. You're married to one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the territory, and you didn't come up through the established social channels. That makes you unpredictable, which makes you dangerous. Margaret sat down across from Rebecca, her expression serious. You need to be very careful how you navigate these relationships. Mrs. Thornfield. The wrong move could isolate both you and Mr. Thornfield from the power structure that keeps this ranch prosperous. That evening, Rebecca shared Eleanor's visit with Marcus over dinner, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as she recounted the conversation. Eleanor Whitman is playing a dangerous game, Marcus said when she finished. She's testing your loyalty to see if you can be manipulated or if you'll need to be neutralized. Neutralized, the word sent ice through Rebecca's veins. Socially neutralized, made irrelevant through isolation and gossip. Marcus set down his fork, his appetite apparently gone. Eleanor controls much of the social structure in this territory, which means she influences business relationships and political alliances. Cross her and you'll find doors closing that you didn't even know existed. So what do I do? You play along for now. Attend her events, support her causes, let her think she's successfully bringing you into line. Marcus's gray eyes were calculating. But you also watch and learn. Eleanor Whitman didn't achieve her position through kindness and charity. She has secrets, and secrets can be useful. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began to understand the intricate web of influence that shaped territorial politics. She attended tea parties where wives discussed their husband's business while pretending to focus on charity work. She participated in planning committees for social events that were really opportunities for political maneuvering. She watched and listened as women who claimed to have no interest in business or politics, shaped both through careful manipulation. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. A small group of influential families controlled most of the territory's resources, from land and water rights to political appointments and business licenses. They maintained their power through a complex system of mutual support and intimidation, using social pressure and economic leverage to keep potential rivals in line. Marcus was part of this system, but Rebecca began to realize he was also somewhat outside it. His wealth and success made him impossible to ignore. But his independence and refusal to be controlled made him dangerous to the established order. The other power brokers tolerated him because they needed him, but they were constantly looking for ways to bring him under their control or eliminate him as a competitor. Rebecca's first real insight into how deep the corruption ran came during a charity luncheon hosted by Patricia Morrison, the wife of the Territorial Land Commissioner. The event was ostensibly to raise funds for a new schoolhouse, but Rebecca quickly realized it was actually a gathering where wives coordinated their husbands' business decisions while maintaining the fiction of feminine domesticity. She sat at a table with women whose husbands controlled various aspects of territorial commerce, listening to conversations that seemed innocent on the surface but carried deeper meanings. When Martha Stevens mentioned that her husband was considering new regulations for water rights, the other women immediately began discussing how those changes might affect their family's interests. When Helen Douglas shared that the territorial governor was planning new appointments to the land board, the discussion shifted to which candidates would be most favorable to established interests. Rebecca began to understand that these women weren't just social companions. They were the invisible power brokers who shaped territorial policy through pillow talk and social pressure. Their husbands might hold the official positions, but the wives were often the ones making the real decisions about how that power would be used. The revelation that shook her most came when she overheard Patricia Morrison and Eleanor Whitman discussing Marcus in hushed tones during a break in the formal program. "He's becoming too independent," Eleanor was saying, her voice barely audible above the general chatter. "Marcus thinks his wealth makes him untouchable, but he's forgotten that money without political backing is vulnerable." "What does your husband think?" Patricia asked, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "William believes it's time to remind Marcus that cooperation is more beneficial than confrontation. The Carver situation could provide the perfect opportunity if it's handled correctly." Rebecca felt her blood run cold. Eleanor Whitman was discussing her husband as if he was a problem to be solved, and she was doing it at a charity luncheon while serving tea and cake. The casual nature of the conversation made it even more chilling than outright threats would have been. That evening, Rebecca confronted Marcus with what she'd learned, watching his expression grow increasingly dark as she recounted the conversation. "They're planning something," she said, pacing his office while he sat behind his desk. "Eleanor and Patricia were talking about you like you're a business problem they need to resolve." "They've been planning something for months," Marcus replied grimly. "The question is what form their resolution will take." "What do you mean?" Marcus stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the ranch lands that represented everything he'd built. "There are several ways to handle an uncooperative business partner, Rebecca. You can isolate them economically, destroy their reputation socially, or create legal problems that force them to seek accommodation. Which approach do you think they'll use?" "All of them probably. But they'll start with social pressure and economic isolation, then escalate if those don't work." Marcus turned back to face her, and she saw something that looked like resignation in his eyes. "I've been expecting this confrontation for months. My marriage to you has simply accelerated their timeline." Rebecca felt guilt wash over her. "This is my fault. If you hadn't married me, they might have left you alone." "No, Rebecca. This was inevitable regardless of our marriage. I've been too successful for too long without playing by their rules. Eventually they were going to move against me." Marcus returned to his desk, pulling out a folder filled with documents. But your presence does give them additional leverage they didn't have before. What kind of leverage? The kind that comes from having something to lose beyond just money and property. Marcus's voice was quiet, but Rebecca heard the underlying tension. They can threaten you to control me, or use you to destroy my reputation if they can prove our marriage is fraudulent. The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. By marrying Marcus for security, she'd inadvertently made both of them more vulnerable than they'd been alone. What can we do? We can be very careful, very smart, and very prepared for whatever they throw at us. Marcus gestured for her to sit down across from his desk. But first you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Over the next hour, Marcus outlined the power structure that controlled territorial politics and commerce. He showed her documents that revealed how land deals were manipulated, how political appointments were bought and sold, how business licenses were granted or denied based on political loyalty rather than merit. The corruption was systematic and pervasive, touching every aspect of territorial life. Judge Whitman isn't just Eleanor's husband, Marcus explained, pointing to a legal document. He's also a partner in several business ventures with Land Commissioner Morrison and Territorial Governor Bradley. They use their official positions to benefit their private interests, and they eliminate anyone who threatens that arrangement. How do they eliminate threats? Sometimes through legal harassment, sometimes through economic pressure, sometimes through more direct methods. Marcus's expression was grim. 3 ranchers who opposed their water rights scheme have lost their properties in the past 2 years. One died in what was ruled an accident, but the circumstances were suspicious. Rebecca stared at the documents, trying to process the scope of what Marcus was revealing. You're telling me that the territorial government is essentially a criminal enterprise. I'm telling you that the line between legitimate business and organized crime is often thinner than people want to believe. Marcus gathered the papers and returned them to their folder. The men who run this territory didn't achieve their positions through honest competition. They did it through manipulation, intimidation, and when necessary, violence. And you've been fighting them alone. I've been avoiding direct confrontation while building my own power base. But there comes a point where avoidance becomes impossible. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Rebecca with those penetrating gray eyes. The question is whether you're prepared to stand with me when that point arrives. Rebecca thought about Eleanor Whitman's veiled threats, about the casual way the territorial wives discussed destroying people who opposed them, about the systematic corruption that permeated every aspect of life in the territory. Then she thought about the alternative, running away and starting over somewhere else, abandoning everything Marcus had built, and letting the corrupt power structure claim another victory. I'm prepared, she said, and meant it completely. But I need to know everything. No more secrets, no more protecting me from unpleasant truths. If we're going to fight these people, I need to understand exactly what we're fighting. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Very well, but understand that once you know everything, there's no going back to ignorance. Knowledge brings responsibility, and responsibility brings danger. I understand. Marcus pulled out another folder, this one thicker and more worn than the first. Then let me tell you about the real reason I needed a wife, and why our marriage represents more than just a business arrangement. What he revealed over the next 2 hours changed Rebecca's understanding of everything. Marcus hadn't just married her for household management or social obligations. He'd married her because he was planning to challenge the corrupt power structure directly, and he needed someone he could trust absolutely when the confrontation began. The evidence he'd been gathering for months painted a picture of systematic fraud and corruption that reached from the territorial capital to the smallest local offices. Land had been stolen through fraudulent surveys and falsified documents. Political appointments had been sold to the highest bidders regardless of qualifications. Business licenses had been denied to honest competitors while being granted to cronies and relatives of the power brokers. I've been building a case that could bring down the entire network, Marcus explained, showing her correspondence with federal authorities and documents that proved the scope of the corruption. But I needed someone inside the social structure who could gather additional evidence and serve as a witness if something happened to me. You married me to be a spy, Rebecca said, feeling a complex mixture of admiration and betrayal. I married you because you're strong enough to handle the truth and smart enough to help me fight for justice. Marcus met her eyes directly. But yes, part of my calculation involved your potential usefulness in gathering intelligence. Rebecca stood and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. The ranch that had seemed like a sanctuary was actually the headquarters of a resistance movement against territorial corruption. The marriage that had promised security was actually a partnership in a dangerous campaign for justice. What happens next? She asked. Next, we continue gathering evidence while appearing to cooperate with the established order. You attend their social events and listen for information we can use. I maintain my business relationships while documenting their illegal activities. Marcus joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. And we prepare for the moment when we reveal everything and watch their world collapse. And if they discover what we're doing before we're ready, then we hope we're strong enough to survive their retaliation. Marcus's voice was quiet but determined. But Rebecca, you need to understand something. I'm committed to this course of action regardless of the personal cost. If you want to leave, if you want to find safety somewhere else, I'll help you do that. But I won't abandon this fight. Rebecca turned to face him, studying the determined set of his jaw and the steel in his gray eyes. This was the real Marcus Thornfield, not the controlled businessman who managed a cattle ranch, but a man willing to risk everything for principles that went beyond personal profit. I'm not leaving, she said firmly. These people threatened me before I even understood who they were. They see me as a weakness they can exploit to control you. Well, they're about to discover that they've seriously underestimated what they're dealing with. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, the expression reached his eyes completely. I hoped you'd say that, but you should know that choosing to stay means choosing to become a target. Eleanor Whitman and her allies won't hesitate to destroy you if they perceive you as a threat. Then we'd better make sure we destroy them first. The next morning brought news that confirmed how serious the situation had become. Tom Bradley rode in before dawn with information that made Marcus's face go white with anger. Carver's filed a lawsuit claiming fraud in the original land purchase, Tom reported. His weathered face grim. Says your father falsified documents 20 years ago and the whole ranch belongs to the Carver family by rights. That's impossible, Rebecca said. Marcus showed me the original deed. Everything was legal. Legal don't matter if the judge is corrupt, Tom replied. And Judge Whitman's already agreed to hear the case next month. Marcus was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed the implications. They're moving faster than I expected. Whitman must feel confident that he can steal the ranch through legal means rather than waiting for other methods to work. What does this mean? Rebecca asked. It means they've decided to destroy me openly rather than through subtle pressure. Marcus's voice was calm, but Rebecca could see the fury burning in his eyes. They're gambling that I don't have enough evidence to fight back, and that federal authorities won't intervene in what appears to be a local land dispute. Do we have enough evidence? We have enough to prove corruption, but proving it and surviving long enough to present it are different challenges. Marcus turned to Tom, double the guards on the perimeter. From now on, nobody comes or goes without my permission. As Tom rode away to implement the new security measures, Rebecca realized that their quiet gathering of evidence was about to become an open war. The corrupt power brokers had decided that Marcus Thornfield represented too great a threat to their system, and they were moving to eliminate that threat before he could expose their crimes. The question was whether Marcus and Rebecca could outmaneuver enemies who controlled the legal system, the political structure, and most of the economic power in the territory. They had truth on their side, but truth had a way of being irrelevant when the people judging it were corrupt. Marcus, Rebecca said as they watched Tom disappear toward the bunkhouse. What you said about federal authorities, how much help can we actually expect from them? Less than I'd like, Marcus admitted. The territorial government has enough autonomy that Washington tends to avoid interfering in local disputes. We'd need to present such overwhelming evidence of corruption that they couldn't ignore it. And do we have that kind of evidence? Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade. We're about to find out.
Because if we don't, then in 1 month Judge Whitman is going to rule that this ranch belongs to Jeremiah Carver, and everything we've built will be lost. Rebecca felt the weight of the challenge settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She'd married Marcus Thornfield thinking she was trading her independence for security, but instead, she'd found herself at the center of a battle that would determine not just their personal futures but the entire balance of power in the territory. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd applied for a job as a kitchen worker and ended up as a partner in a fight against systematic corruption. The woman who'd walked up to Marcus's door with nothing but desperation and determination was now one of the few people standing between the territory and complete domination by criminals who wore the masks of respectability. But as she looked at Marcus's determined profile against the morning sky, Rebecca realized she wouldn't trade her position for all the security in the world. For the first time in her life, she was fighting for something bigger than mere survival. She was fighting for justice, for truth, and for the right of honest people to build lives without being destroyed by the corrupt and powerful. The question was whether they were strong enough to win a war against enemies who controlled all the traditional weapons of power. Rebecca suspected they were about to find out just how much strength they actually possessed. Part 5: Opposition emerges. The retaliation began with small acts of sabotage that could have been accidents if viewed in isolation, but formed a clear pattern of escalating harassment when seen together. 3 days after Tom Bradley reported Carver's lawsuit, Rebecca discovered that someone had poisoned the feed in the north pasture, sickening 6 head of cattle and requiring expensive veterinary treatment. The next morning, the main water trough was found contaminated with salt, forcing the ranch hands to haul fresh water from the river until repairs could be made. Marcus received each report with grim acceptance, as if he'd been expecting exactly this kind of pressure campaign. He doubled the night watch and instituted new security protocols that turned the ranch into an armed camp, but the attacks continued with methodical persistence. Fences were cut in remote sections that required hours of riding to repair. Supplies disappeared from storage sheds despite locked doors and posted guards. Equipment broke down with suspicious frequency, requiring costly repairs that strained the ranch's resources. "They're trying to bleed us dry," Marcus explained to Rebecca as they reviewed the mounting costs of the sabotage campaign. "Death by 1,000 cuts, designed to weaken us financially and psychologically before the court hearing." "Who's doing it?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Carver's men probably. But they're being careful to avoid direct confrontation or obvious evidence that could be traced back to them." Marcus set down the ledger with controlled violence. "It's the kind of harassment that's designed to be just subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability." The psychological pressure was almost worse than the economic damage. Rebecca found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking over her shoulder when she walked between buildings, sleeping poorly as she listened for signs of intrusion. The constant vigilance was exhausting, and she could see similar strain in the faces of the ranch hands and household staff. But the real escalation came when the harassment moved beyond property damage to personal threats. Rebecca discovered the first message pinned to her bedroom door one morning when she woke to find a piece of paper that hadn't been there the night before. The words were written in crude block letters that suggested someone trying to disguise their handwriting. "Some wives need to learn their place." She brought the note to Marcus immediately, watching his face go deadly calm as he read the brief message. "They're inside the house," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Someone got past all your security and came into my room while I was sleeping." "Not your room," Marcus corrected grimly. "This was pinned to the outside of your door. But the point stands. Someone breached the house's defenses without triggering any alarms." The implications were terrifying. If their enemies could get close enough to leave threatening messages, they could just as easily deliver more permanent forms of violence. Rebecca felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack as the reality of their vulnerability sank in. "How is that possible?" she asked. "You have guards posted, locks on all the doors, men patrolling the grounds. Which means either our security measures are inadequate or someone with inside knowledge is helping them." Marcus folded the note carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. I'm afraid I know which possibility is more likely. The idea that someone inside the ranch was working with their enemies was almost too awful to contemplate. Rebecca had grown to trust the people around her, from Margaret's motherly care to Tom Bradley's gruff protection. The thought that one of them might be betraying Marcus to his enemies made her feel sick. Who? She asked. I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Marcus's voice carried a cold fury that reminded Rebecca of why other men feared him. In the meantime, you're not to be alone anywhere on the ranch. Margaret will accompany you during the day, and I'll post guards outside your room at night. The security measures made Rebecca feel like a prisoner in her own home, but she didn't argue. The message had been clear enough in its implications. Someone wanted her to understand that she was vulnerable, that the protection Marcus provided wasn't absolute, that her safety depended on her cooperation with forces beyond her husband's control. But Rebecca had learned something important during her weeks on the ranch. Fear could be a useful emotion if you didn't let it control your decisions. Instead of cowering, she decided to use her anger at being threatened to fuel her determination to fight back. I want to help find the traitor, she told Marcus that evening. I move through the house and grounds differently than you do. I might notice things that escape your attention. Absolutely not. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to threaten you directly. I won't have you putting yourself in additional danger by investigating. I'm already in danger, Rebecca pointed out. The message proved that. But sitting passively, while we're attacked from within and without, won't make me any safer. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her safety against the potential value of her assistance. What did you have in mind? I pay attention to who has access to different parts of the house, who knows our routines, who might have information about our security arrangements. Rebecca moved to the window, checking the yard before continuing. I also listen to conversations that people might not expect me to overhear, such as the fact that 3 of the newer ranch hands have been asking Margaret questions about your business practices and my background. Questions that seem innocent individually but form a pattern of intelligence gathering when viewed together. Marcus's eyebrows rose. You've been watching them. I've been watching everyone. Living in this house has taught me that survival depends on understanding the people around you. Rebecca turned back to face him. The newer hands aren't the only ones acting strangely. 2 of the older men have been taking longer than necessary to complete routine tasks, especially jobs that require them to work near the house or stables. Which men? Jake Morrison and Bill Stevens. They've both been finding excuses to linger in areas where they might overhear conversations or observe our routines. Rebecca sat down across from Marcus's desk. I could be wrong, but their behavior feels purposeful rather than coincidental. Marcus made notes as she spoke, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. Morrison was hired 6 months ago on Tom Bradley's recommendation. Stevens has been here for 3 years and was always considered reliable. People's loyalties can change, especially when they're offered enough money or subjected to enough pressure. Rebecca leaned forward. The question is how to prove our suspicions without alerting them that we're watching. What followed was a careful campaign of observation and misdirection designed to identify the source of the security leaks. Marcus began providing different information to different groups of ranch hands, then waited to see which false details appeared in the enemy's actions. Rebecca started varying her routines unpredictably, making it harder for anyone to anticipate her movements or plan attacks. The breakthrough came when Rebecca noticed Jake Morrison paying unusual attention to a conversation between Marcus and Tom Bradley about moving cattle to different pastures. The next day, she convinced Marcus to share false information about planning to transport valuable breeding stock to a distant section of the ranch. 2 nights later, a group of riders was spotted near the location Marcus had mentioned, clearly waiting to intercept a cattle movement that was never going to happen. When Tom Bradley and several ranch hands rode out to investigate, they found evidence of a planned ambush that could have resulted in significant losses of both livestock and human life. Morrison sold us out, Tom reported when he returned to the house. Had to be him. Nobody else knew about the fake cattle movement except him and Bill Stevens. "Where is Morrison now?" Marcus asked. "Gone. Disappeared sometime after midnight, took his horse and personal gear. Left behind a month's wages, which suggests he was in a hurry to leave." Rebecca felt a mixture of vindication and unease. They'd identified one source of the security leaks, but Morrison's flight raised new questions about how deeply their enemies had penetrated the ranch's defenses. "What about Stevens?" she asked. "Still here, still acting normal. Either he's innocent or he's a better actor than Morrison." Tom's weathered face was grim. "But we can't trust anyone completely until this is over." The discovery of Morrison's betrayal had immediate consequences for ranch security. Marcus instituted new protocols that compartmentalized information and limited access to sensitive areas of the property. He also began varying his own routines, making it harder for any remaining spies to predict his movements or plans. But the most significant change was in Rebecca's role within the
household. Marcus began including her in security discussions and strategic planning sessions, recognizing that her observations had been crucial in identifying the threat from within. "You have good instincts for this kind of work," he told her after a particularly productive discussion about defensive preparations. "I'm beginning to think my original assessment of your capabilities was conservative." "What was your original assessment?" "That you were strong enough to survive in a dangerous environment. I'm now thinking you might be strong enough to help me change that environment for the better." The validation meant more to Rebecca than she'd expected. She'd spent most of her life simply trying to survive, accepting circumstances she couldn't control and adapting to situations imposed by other people's decisions. But Marcus was suggesting she could be more than a survivor. He was implying she could be an agent of change, someone who shaped circumstances rather than merely enduring them. But the next escalation in their enemy's campaign reminded Rebecca that being recognized as a threat also meant becoming a target for more serious forms of retaliation. The second threatening message appeared 3 days after Morrison's disappearance, and its contents were far more explicit than the first. This time, the note was left on Marcus's desk in his locked office, a demonstration that their security improvements hadn't eliminated all their vulnerabilities. The message itself was brief but chilling. Marcus Thornfield should remember that accidents happen to women who forget their place. Marcus read the note aloud in a voice that was carefully controlled but carried undertones of barely restrained fury. "They're escalating because the subtle approach isn't working. Direct threats mean they're getting desperate. Or it means they're getting confident," Rebecca countered. "Maybe they think they have us so isolated and vulnerable that they can afford to be more open about their intentions. Either way, we need to assume the threat is serious." Marcus locked the note in his desk drawer alongside the first one. "I'm going to send a telegraph to the federal marshal in Carson City. It's time to involve outside authorities before this situation spirals completely out of control. Will they help?" "They'll help if I can present them with enough evidence to justify federal intervention in what appears to be a local dispute." Marcus pulled out the files containing evidence of territorial corruption. "The challenge is proving that what's happening here is part of a larger pattern of criminal activity rather than just a personal vendetta." That evening, as Rebecca prepared for bed under the watchful eyes of guards posted outside her door, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since walking up to Marcus's front porch. She'd sought security and found herself at the center of a war between corruption and justice. She'd married a stranger for practical reasons and discovered a partner whose principles matched her own deepest convictions. But she'd also learned that fighting for justice was more dangerous and complicated than she'd ever imagined. Their enemies weren't just individuals with personal grudges, they were part of a system that had been built to protect itself against challenges from people like Marcus and Rebecca. The question was whether they could survive long enough to expose that system before it destroyed them. Rebecca suspected they were about to find out just how far their enemies were willing to go to protect their corrupt empire. As she lay in bed listening to the guards moving outside her door, Rebecca realized that the woman who'd applied for kitchen work at a cruel rancher's house had been naive about what strength really meant. Real strength wasn't just about surviving bad circumstances, it was about having the courage to fight for better ones even when the odds seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities to prove that honest people could stand up to corrupt power when they were willing to risk everything for what was right. Rebecca fell asleep thinking about that challenge, and about the gray-eyed man sleeping in another part of the house who'd shown her that she was capable of much more than mere survival. The federal marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Rebecca's life into before and after. Marshal Daniel Hayes rode up to the ranch house with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of dealing with dangerous men in lawless territories. He was a lean man with intelligent eyes and hands that rested casually near his weapons, giving the impression of someone who could handle whatever trouble he encountered. Rebecca watched from the kitchen window as Marcus greeted the marshal on the front porch, noting how both men carried themselves with the careful respect of professionals who understood the gravity of their situation. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since Marcus had sent his detailed reports to the territorial authorities. But now that it was here, she felt a mixture of hope and terror that left her hands trembling as she prepared pour and meeting Kauf. Mrs. Thornfield, Marshal Hayes said when Marcus brought him into the kitchen for introductions. I've read your husband's correspondence with great interest. Your observations about territorial politics have been particularly illuminating. I've simply reported what I've seen and heard, Rebecca replied, setting cups on the kitchen table. Though I suspect what I've witnessed represents only a small portion of the actual corruption. Your suspicions are correct. Marshal Hayes accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the steam before taking a careful sip. My investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic fraud involving land deals, political appointments, and judicial decisions across 3 territories. What's happening here isn't an isolated incident. Over the next several hours, Marshal Hayes laid out the scope of federal involvement in territorial corruption cases. He explained that Washington had been receiving reports about irregularities in territorial governance for months, but had lacked sufficient evidence to justify intervention until Marcus's detailed documentation provided the missing pieces of a larger puzzle. Judge Whitman and his associates have been selling legal decisions for years, Hayes revealed, spreading documents across Marcus's desk. Land commissioners taking bribes to falsify surveys, territorial governors appointing cronies to lucrative positions, sheriffs providing protection to criminal enterprises in exchange for political support. The corruption goes all the way to the territorial capital. Rebecca felt vindicated but also overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd been fighting. How do we prove all of this in court? We don't, at least not in territorial court. Hayes smiled grimly. Federal authorities have jurisdiction over territorial governance issues, which means Judge Whitman won't be presiding over any trials related to his own criminal activities. Marcus leaned back in his chair, and Rebecca saw relief flood his features for the first time in months. What about the Carver lawsuit? Can Whitman still rule on that? Judge Whitman is being arrested this afternoon on federal charges of corruption and judicial misconduct. His pending cases will be transferred to a federal judge who will review them for evidence of bias or fraud. Hayes consulted his notes. I suspect Mr. Carver's land claim will be dismissed when subjected to honest judicial scrutiny. The arrests began that same evening and continued for 3 days as federal agents rounded up members of the corruption network. Rebecca watched from her bedroom window as Eleanor Whitman was escorted from her house in shackles, the woman's imperious dignity finally cracking as she realized her world of influence and manipulation was collapsing around her. Judge Whitman himself was taken into custody while presiding over court, federal marshals interrupting his proceedings to inform him that he was under arrest for violations of federal law. The symbolic power of that moment resonated throughout the territory as word spread that even the most powerful figures weren't above justice when federal authorities decided to act. Patricia Morrison tried to flee with her husband when they learned of the impending arrests, but they were intercepted at the territorial border and brought back to face charges. Land Commissioner Morrison's files revealed the full extent of the fraudulent land deals that had enriched the conspirators while dispossessing honest settlers of their rightful property. But the most satisfying arrest, from Rebecca's perspective, was that of Jeremiah Carver. When federal agents examined his land claim against the Thornfield Ranch, they discovered that Carver had been working with corrupt officials to fabricate evidence supporting his case. The documents he'd submitted as proof of his family's ownership were revealed to be forgeries created specifically to steal Marcus's property. Carver won't be filing any more lawsuits, Marshal Hayes told Rebecca and Marcus as they reviewed the charges against various conspirators. He's facing federal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of property through false legal claims. As the scope of the corruption network became clear, Rebecca began to understand how close they'd come to losing everything. The Carver lawsuit had been just one part of a comprehensive plan to destroy Marcus's independence and seize his assets. If they hadn't fought back when they did, if they hadn't gathered evidence and contacted federal authorities, Marcus would have lost his ranch and probably his life. How many others were targeted like we were? Rebecca asked. Dozens across multiple territories. Small ranchers, independent businessmen, anyone who represented competition to the established power structure. Hayes's expression was grim. Most of them didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. The trials that followed were swift and decisive. With federal prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of corruption, most of the conspirators chose to negotiate plea agreements rather than face the full penalties for their crimes. Judge Whitman received a 10-year prison sentence and forfeiture of all assets acquired through corrupt practices. Eleanor Whitman was sentenced to 5 years for her role in the conspiracy, her carefully constructed social empire reduced to rubble. Land Commissioner Morrison received 15 years for his central role in the fraudulent land deals, while his wife Patricia received a shorter sentence for her participation in the conspiracy. Jeremiah Carver was sentenced to 12 years for fraud and conspiracy, his dreams of reclaiming what he imagined was his family's legacy ending in complete disgrace. But the most significant outcome wasn't the individual sentences, it was the dismantling of the entire corrupt system that had controlled territorial politics. New officials were appointed from outside the territory, bringing fresh perspectives and honest governance to replace the criminal enterprise that had masqueraded as legitimate government. This territory has a chance to start over, Marshal Hayes told Rebecca and Marcus before departing. What you've accomplished here will benefit honest people for generations to come. As life gradually returned to normal on the ranch, Rebecca found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her from desperate job applicant to partner in a fight for justice. The woman who'd walked up to Marcus's door seeking kitchen work had discovered capabilities she'd never known she possessed, strength that went far beyond mere survival. Her relationship with Marcus had evolved as well, transforming from a practical business arrangement into something deeper and more meaningful. The man who'd married her for household management had become a true partner, someone who valued her intelligence and courage as much as her domestic skills. Do you regret it? Marcus asked one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. Agreeing to marry a stranger who dragged you into a war you never chose. Never, Rebecca replied without hesitation. I thought I was trading my independence for security, but instead I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. What's that? Purpose. The chance to fight for something bigger than my own survival. Rebecca reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The chance to discover who I really am when I'm not just trying to survive. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. And who are you, Mrs. Rebecca Thornfield? I'm someone who doesn't back down from a fight, especially when the fight is worth having. I'm someone who can build a life worth living instead of just enduring whatever life throws at me. Rebecca turned to look at him, seeing her own contentment reflected in his gray eyes. I'm someone who chose love instead of just accepting whatever was offered. Love. Marcus's eyebrows rose in surprise. I thought we agreed this was a practical arrangement. We did agree to that, but agreements can be renegotiated when circumstances change. Rebecca smiled, feeling happier than she'd ever imagined possible. The question is whether you're interested in renegotiating the terms of our partnership. Marcus's answer came not in words but in a kiss that was nothing like the formal peck he'd given her on their wedding day. This kiss spoke of genuine affection, of partnership built on mutual respect and shared trials, of a love that had grown from practical foundations into something neither of them had expected but both had learned to cherish. When they finally broke apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, Rebecca Thornfield. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you refused to be intimidated by Pete Morrison's cheating. That early? Rebecca laughed, remembering how nervous she'd been during those first days as Marcus's wife. I was terrified most of the time. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of fear. Marcus brushed a strand of hair away from her face. You've been the most courageous person I've ever known from the day you walked up to my door with nothing but determination. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the same kitchen where she'd first learned to manage a large household, but now she was training the wives of neighboring ranchers in the domestic skills that had once seemed so overwhelming. The territory's new government had brought stability and prosperity that allowed honest businesses to flourish, and Marcus's ranch had become a model for ethical practices that other operations sought to emulate. The kitchen that had once seemed impossibly large now felt perfectly sized for the elaborate dinner parties. Rebecca hosted for territorial officials, federal representatives, and visiting dignitaries. She'd discovered she had a talent for diplomacy that complemented Marcus's business acumen, and together they'd become influential voices in the territory's development. But the most satisfying change was in Rebecca herself. The woman who'd applied for kitchen work because she was desperate for any employment now ran multiple household operations and managed charitable organizations that supported families throughout the territory. She'd found her voice in territorial politics, advocating for women's rights and educational opportunities with the same determination she'd once applied to mere survival. Sometimes I can barely remember what it felt like to be afraid all the time, she told Margaret one afternoon as they planned menus for an upcoming reception honoring the territory's new governor. Fear has a way of fading when you realize you're stronger than whatever you were afraid of, Margaret replied with a smile. Though I have to say, Mrs. Thornfield, you've exceeded even my expectations for adaptation. What were your expectations? I expected you to survive Mr. Thornfield's demands and perhaps even find some happiness in your new position. Margaret's eyes twinkled with amusement. I didn't expect you to transform him from a lonely businessman into a man who laughs at dinner and takes pride in his wife's accomplishments. Rebecca looked through the kitchen window at Marcus, who was discussing cattle breeding techniques with Tom Bradley and several neighboring ranchers. The man who'd married her for practical reasons had become someone who celebrated her successes as enthusiastically as his own, who sought her advice on business decisions and valued her opinions on everything from politics to philosophy. He's transformed me just as much, Rebecca observed. I thought strength meant enduring whatever happened to you. He taught me that real strength means changing what you don't like instead of just accepting it. That evening, as Rebecca prepared for bed in the elegant room that had become truly hers rather than just a place she was allowed to sleep, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this point. The desperate woman who'd walked 20 miles to apply for kitchen work had discovered that she was capable of changing not just her own life but the entire structure of territorial society. The marriage that had begun as a business transaction had evolved into a partnership based on love, respect, and shared commitment to justice. The kitchen work she'd sought had expanded into household management, community leadership, and political influence that reached across multiple territories. But most importantly, the security she desperately needed had been replaced by something far more valuable. The knowledge that she was strong enough to create her own security, wise enough to choose her own battles, and brave enough to fight for the life she wanted rather than just accepting whatever life offered her. Marcus found her standing at the bedroom window, gazing out at the ranch lands that stretched to the horizon under a canopy of stars that seemed infinite in their beauty and promise. Any regrets? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Only one, Rebecca replied, leaning back against his chest and feeling the solid warmth of his presence. What's that? I regret that it took me so long to realize I deserved something better than just surviving. Rebecca turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd shown her that love could be both practical and passionate, that marriage could be both secure and adventurous. I regret all the years I spent thinking that strength meant accepting whatever circumstances other people created for me. And now I know that real strength means creating the circumstances you want to live in. Rebecca smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from building a life based on her own choices rather than other people's limitations. Now I know that the best security comes not from finding someone to protect you, but from becoming someone strong enough to protect what you love.
Marcus kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of promise and partnership, of shared struggles overcome and future adventures to be embraced together. When they finally separated, Rebecca realized that the woman who'd applied for kitchen work at a cruel rancher's house had found something far more valuable than employment. She'd found herself. The next morning brought new challenges and opportunities, as every morning did in a territory that was still growing and changing. Rebecca woke early to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, just as she had during those first nervous days as Marcus's wife. But now the kitchen felt like her domain, rather than a test of her worthiness, and the men who gathered around the table treated her with the genuine respect of people who'd seen her prove her strength during the most difficult times. As she watched the sun rise over the desert landscape that had become her home, Rebecca thought about all the women who might still be walking dusty roads toward uncertain futures, seeking security in whatever employment they could find. She thought about the strength they carried without recognizing it, the potential they possessed for transforming not just their own lives but the world around them. Someday, she decided, she would find ways to help those women discover what she'd learned, that applying for kitchen work at a cruel rancher's house might be the beginning of a journey toward becoming someone you never imagined you could be. But for now, she was content to be Mrs. Rebecca Thornfield, wife of Marcus, partner in prosperity, defender of justice, and living proof that sometimes the most practical marriages could grow into the most passionate love stories. The breakfast bell rang across the ranch yard, calling honest workers to fuel up for another day of honest labor in a territory where corruption had been replaced by opportunity, where strength was measured by integrity rather than intimidation, and where a woman who'd once sought only survival had learned to build the life of her dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.